Death Doula. Hello everyone, welcome to Signpost for Living with Dr. Kirsten Hunter. We've got a very dear friend of mine, Deb Anderson here. Hello Deb.
Good morning Kirsten,
Hey.
Lovely to be here.
Yes, we finally got here. Long anticipated this conversation.
It's been worth the wait.
Yeah. So we're talking about a death doula, being a death doula. You are a death doula. So everyone, first of all, I would argue most people maybe haven't heard of a death doula and by default don't know what a death doula is. So can you describe what a death doula is?
Sure. You're very correct in your assumption that a lot of people don't know what a death doula is.
Yeah.
So some people would have heard of a birth doula.
Yes.
So that's someone who supports the person going through birth.
Yeah.
And equally at the other end, a death doula is someone who supports the person and their families going through and approaching death. The word doula is a Greek word that simply means to be of service.
Really?
Because
I've
the word
always
doula
wondered.
is a little bit confusing to people. They've
Yeah.
never heard of it.
Yeah.
But it's a very simple word, meaning to be of service,
Yeah.
coming from the Greek language. So you put the two together, death doula, it's someone who supports and assists people approaching death.
Yeah.
And we also support their families and those closest to them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't support them just at the point of death. It can be leading up to death and even after death.
Mm.
So we provide after death care, and we also can support the families after death as well. So it covers a whole range of transition points. So we can be supporting someone for as short a time as several weeks, or we can support someone for 12 months, and we can phase in and out of their care as their needs require.
And I imagine that they come to look for you when, say, a diagnosis comes along and there's a prognosis, there's a time frame. Is that right?
That's right. So usually we're engaged if someone's been given a life-limiting diagnosis or a terminal diagnosis. And as you can imagine, for most people, that's very confronting and confusing and overwhelming.
Terrifying for many.
Not only for the person, but for their families as well.
Yeah.
And so it's a very, very confusing time, and a lot of people just are drawn along in that path, and they have lots of questions, and they don't often know, Kirsten, that they have choices and that there are options available. And the sad thing is, I often hear people say, I didn't know that was available, or I didn't know that I could do that.
What kind of things are you meaning? Services or?
It could be things like, I didn't know that I had a choice if I could die at home or not.
Oh, that's enormous, isn't it?
And certainly that option is available,
Yeah.
and it's possible. But we need to have those conversations because it requires a lot of planning. But with the right support services, it can be done. But it's important to also let people know that whilst that's their choice, it's good to have a plan B in the event that things happen that are unexpected with the patient's condition, that there's a plan B in place, and that everyone's on board with that.
Because you can't become fixed, can you? You don't know what's going to come. You don't know that you're going to have to make some decisions on the way based on how things play out.
That's right. It can be very
A
unpredictable.
bit like a birth, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's like, I'm going to have a natural birth and that's it, actually. Knock, knock, knock. Phew.
That's a really good point, because when you think about all the preparation and thought that goes into pre-birth, and how that will go, and what sort of birth mum wants, and who will be involved, and how it's all going to look, we don't put that preparation into dying and death.
It's a really good point. Yes.
We just don't, because people are so uncomfortable talking about it, which is a shame.
Let's talk about that. So earlier you mentioned that the word death doula itself doesn't necessarily go well with people because the word death is not comfortable. So you call it end of life.
Yeah. In America, death doulas are well recognised.
Really? Right.
And in America, they're called a death doula or a death walker.
Death walker?
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah. Death doulas are also well recognised in the UK. But in Australia, it's sort of an emerging profession.
It's not like Australia to be behind the times, is it?
So we're a little bit back, sort of, as we do, we follow, don't we? We follow America, we follow the
Not
UK.
proud of it, but we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we've done in Australia, we've sort of, a lot of people call themselves end-of-life doula,
Mm-hmm.
and it just softens.
A bit less confronting.
It softens the approach. Yeah.
It's understandable.
And it has almost become impolite to talk about death,
Yeah.
which is a shame because death is a normal part of living. And what we need to do is start to normalise conversations around death and dying, because what a lot of people don't understand is that there is such a thing as a preferred death or a good death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to suggest that any death is good, but the process can be good in that it's your preferred options. But in order to do that, you have to be given all the choices so that you can make an informed decision about how your death and how your dying process is going to look. And that's what I think we're trying to get through to people, because to give you some statistics, Kirsten, partly because of the baby boomer population, the baby boomers, it's a well-known statistic that by 2044 the death rates in Australia will double.
That's incredible.
It is incredible.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that in 2044 we're going to have this tsunami.
No. But we had double the birth rate at one point, so therefore we're going to have double the death rate.
That's right.
It just goes to make sense, yeah.
And I guess the point is we're on that trajectory now. So we're seeing an increase now. And in Australia, we're not going to have enough nursing home beds, palliative care units and hospice places to cater for all of those deaths. So there are government organisations and little pockets of people all around Australia sitting at a table having discussions now about how we're going to deal with this. So as Australians, we need to rethink how we're doing death. And it could be that for where it's possible and for those that are comfortable to do so, that death comes back into the home.
Right, yeah.
And as you know, as recently as 70 years ago and prior to that, for the expected death, so the grandma who was in her 80s or 90s and expected just to die of old age, it was quite normal for death to happen in the home. But as medical advances have happened, death has become medicalised.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily a medical event.
Yes, it's seen as an alarm, quick get medical intervention, when it's actually a natural process.
That's right.
And also family being less comfortable to deal with that in the home. Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. And, death at home was considered normal. And, grandma would be laid out in the front room and the family would visit and the neighbours would visit and the kids would be running around. But that's sort of been taken away as it's become more medicalised.
Yeah.
And because of the advances in medicine, people are staying alive longer.
Absolutely, which is great, but it changes the demographic, doesn't it? And it's interesting if we go back to our roots when we lived in tribes. We were very comfortable with birth and with death. We were exposed to that. That was understood. Whereas now there's more of a distancing between experiencing death and being responsible for that person at that point. And
Very
it's
much
becoming
so.
quite scary for people. Yeah.
And as you know, in some cultures, death is almost celebrated.
Wow.
And time is spent with that person after death.
Yes.
And New Zealand is a great example of that. You know, their traditional owners, that's a very normal part of what they do with death. But in Australia, because it's become more medicalised and commercialised with the advancement of the funeral industry in Australia, it's very quick and cut and dried.
And in these other cultures, when they would keep the loved one in the home for, I know some cultures they have them for 3 days, and others for longer as well. So there's a comfortableness, isn't there? A preparedness to be with that person after they've passed away.
That's right.
Whereas now we have viewings, and the viewings are with people who have been, presented in a much more comfortable living type presentation. We've really moved a long way away from being comfortable with the passed away person.
We have.
Yeah.
And I guess for those that are comfortable to do so, we're hoping to bring that back.
Really?
Because research is telling us that for people that are comfortable to do so, to spend the time with the person after they've died can be quite helpful in starting the grieving process.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, often when people can't make a funeral or they can't make a viewing, they say it doesn't seem real that the person's passed away. They don't have that visual connection, and if there's a traumatic death somewhere, the amount of effort we put in to finding the body is extraordinary. And that's, again, because of this sense of needing to connect with that person who has passed away.
That's right.
So it's very interesting. And, I think a lot of people in the medical world don't understand that after someone's passed away, you can stay with that person, you can sit with them, you don't have to have them whisked away. It's really interesting that people don't know that.
And again, you've hit the nail on the head with choices, and I didn't know that I could do that.
Yeah.
And so that's part of what I do as a death doula, is to advocate for people and say, well, yes, you can. You can spend time with your loved one after they've died if you're comfortable to do so.
Yeah, it's a choice. It's
and
an important
indeed,
choice.
You can spend as much time as you'd like.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that sometimes it seems impolite to talk about death, and that people can actually think it's not going to happen. Can you tell me what your experience is there?
Sure. And I think partly that is because people are very afraid. They're afraid of the unknown. They find it very, very difficult to start that conversation with their loved ones.
And the conversation would be, how do you feel about?
The conversation that we're encouraging people to have very gently, because we understand that it's such a sensitive topic. The conversations we encourage people to start with their loved ones is letting someone know what your wishes are.
Okay.
Very, very important, because we so often see someone's died and the family are in a world of grief and shock, and their emotions are heightened, and we so often hear we didn't even know if mum or dad wanted to be cremated or buried. We never discussed it.
Yeah.
We don't know if they wanted what sort of funeral they wanted, who they wanted there, what songs they want played, what hymns they want played. We didn't know if mum or dad would have preferred to die at home or not.
And you really want to respect their choices, don't you? And if you don't know what they are, you can't find out. So it's so important. I think it's also fascinating to me as a psychologist that when you come to that loved one and you gently say, what are your preferences, what are your choices, you're opening the door to the acknowledgement that they are going to pass away. And so many people just don't want to have that conversation, and I think it actually gives the person who's passing away the choice to then talk about their acknowledgement of their impending death and how they feel about that. And if they're feeling settled, they have an opportunity to communicate that to the family. If they're feeling fearful, they have an opportunity to be supported. I think that facilitates a much deeper conversation as well, which is wonderful.
It does. And it's not to suggest that the whole conversation has to happen at once, because that's unrealistic.
Yes.
It can be as simple as, oh, that's a wonderful song I've just heard on the radio. That's one of your favourite songs. Wouldn't that be great to be included in your funeral service?
Yeah.
And it could be a 5-minute conversation, but it's a start. It's a real start point. And the other important thing that I discovered is that people don't prepare their wills.
Oh, yes. Because that means that they're going to die in some people's minds, which is a denial factor.
And, you know, Kirsten, talking about death won't kill you. Just as equally as talking about sex won't make you pregnant. You know, that's a fact.
It's so true.
Talking about the clouds in the sky won't make it rain.
Yeah.
But for some reason, we just...
Well, when people's coping mechanism is denial, it's pulling them out of that coping mechanism, hey? And they do become very fearful about, you know, having a will, because they do connect the two, which is ridiculous. But I do understand it does pull them out of their denial, pulls their head out of the sand, a bit uncomfortable.
So if I'm meeting people for the first time, obviously I listen first. I listen to where they're at. I meet them where they're at emotionally. I hold space with them. And then once we get that through, we get through that initial transition period, one of the first things I ask them is, do you have a will? Do you have an advance healthcare directive? And do you have an enduring power of attorney? And those 3 things are really critical for the person and their loved ones. So the advance healthcare directive really is about your wishes at the end of life. And a simple way to put that, Kirsten, is to say to people, if you couldn't speak for yourself, who would you have speak for you, and what would you have them say? And people really need to sit with that, because it's a very important part of planning for their future.
It's the ultimate trust exercise, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You know, do you really understand me, and do I trust you to advocate for me when I'm utterly vulnerable? Yeah, definitely.
That's right, because the medical team, and it's their job to continue to treat you and to keep you alive, because that's their job.
Even when you might not have quality of life and you don't want that.
That's right.
And I think that also for family members, if there's a directive, it's so incredibly comforting to know you're doing that person's wishes, and it takes the responsibility from them.
It takes a lot of stress off the family. And everyone's on the same page.
Yeah.
And the other point to make, Kirsten, is that it's not set in concrete.
Right.
So you might make an advanced care directive today, but in 4 months' time, you might just rethink something. You can go and change it. So it's not set in concrete.
Do you need a lawyer to do that?
You probably need to have it witnessed.
Yeah.
But you can change it. And you need to let people know that that's changed.
Again, education. Very
that's
important.
Right.
Yep.
So that the team that is supporting you, and that includes your medical team, you know, it could be your death doula, your family, your friends, your palliative care nurses, are all on the same page.
Absolutely. Very, very important. And when you said earlier, in our nice little chat earlier, you said it's not going to happen. Death is not going to happen. Can you talk about that a bit? When people they think they have more time. Do you come across that?
All the time.
Really?
Everyone thinks they've got more time. And that's just this, I guess this sense of it's not going to happen to me. I don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with it because it's too hard to deal with. But I encourage people to, let me put it this way, I would encourage people to have those 3 things in place.
Yes.
No matter what age they are.
Right.
You know, young parents.
Really?
Well, when you
I
think
just
about...
associate that with elderly, but you're absolutely right.
No, because young people die, sadly.
Oh my gosh. I have not thought of this before.
I
don't have one. Do you have one?
I'm about to get one.
You go. To do for you and I.
You know, the young mum or the young dad, There's always a traumatic death, an unexpected death, accidents happen. You can imagine a 30-year-old husband and wife with 2 kids.
I think this is fascinating. Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
One of them, there's a car accident.
Yeah, horrendous.
The devastation that family is facing is unimaginable, and none of those things are in place.
And to be clear, the probability of a traumatic death is very low, but nevertheless, if it happens, it's the way to ultimately care for your family, to support them. That's fascinating, because I think people do routinely, hopefully, get wills and power of attorneys set up, and I think that's what the lawyers will advocate for. And I mean, I've recently just redone mine, but there was no discussion whatsoever about getting a health directive. None. And it has never occurred to me. There you go.
It's really important. And what I say to people is have a think about this, all these things that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Even if you're young.
Yeah.
Plan it, prepare it, and park it.
Plan, prepare, park.
Yeah, park it away and go on with living your wonderful life. But it's there in the background should the unexpected happen. Okay, you don't need to dwell on it.
Yep.
And review it from time to time.
I think also people don't know how to get them, healthcare directives. Do you know how people get them?
Absolutely.
How do they do them?
You just Google it.
Right. Good old Google.
Make sure you get the one that's relevant for your state.
Right.
So each state in Australia has a slightly different pro forma.
And internationally, people would have their international versions. Yep.
You simply download it. There's a section that you need to complete. You need to have it signed off by your doctor.
Right.
And you need to have it witnessed by a JP or a solicitor or some such thing. When it's done, though, make sure that the right people have a copy.
Right, and the right people would be power of
make sure
attorney.
you've got a copy.
Yes.
Your GP, your solicitor, and a family member.
And the power of attorney.
That's right.
Yeah, fantastic. And does it prompt you with regard to your choices?
Yes, it does.
Because people would need prompting as well, because they wouldn't know what the questions are to answer. There you go, everybody. Jump on and Google. Get your, what's it called?
Advanced Healthcare Directive.
Advanced Healthcare Directive. That's too long. But yes. And it sounds very doable. You don't need to go to a lawyer. I think that's another big barrier. People think if you have to go to a lawyer to get something, it's a big job.
No.
So, that's very interesting. So why do you think people think we've got more time? Why do you think we're not comfortable with death?
I think it's the fear of the unknown. And let's face it, as humans, we're very connected.
Yes.
Aren't we?
Yep.
And so we don't want to contemplate what it's going to be like to not be with that person or, our best person. We don't want to contemplate that.
Yes.
And people, as you would know in your profession, people avoid having the hard conversations.
Absolutely. I have people who come along and they have a diagnosis, a prognosis where they've got a matter of time, and they come to talk about how they feel about death because they cannot talk with family because it's too scary for family. And they come in and talk about their fears, their confusion, their grief. And that's what we spend the time doing. I spend a lot of time talking about death, a lot. And I love that they can come in and they don't have to worry about me, and that's the thing. I can't talk to my loved ones because I'm worrying about them. So I think that's another point as well. That's a pathway to go and see a psychologist and just have a huge amount of support. It's such a great resource that fortunately a lot of people are switching on to as well. So there's a bit of an overlap in our role.
There is an overlap, Kirsty.
Love it.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
And the other point I'd make too is sometimes it's not the person with the diagnosis that is reluctant to talk about death. Sometimes it's their family.
Yeah.
So often I see where the person might bring up the subject of, look, I just need to let you know these few things, or I want that beautiful vase to go to granddaughter A, B or C. And what happens is sometimes they're immediately shut down. Yeah. Oh, Mum, we don't need to be talking about that now, and we've got so much other nicer stuff to be.
Yeah.
And so the daughter is not ready to have the conversation, and unknowingly she has just shut the door.
Yeah, and the person in question is not able to keep that conversation, which they need to have.
That's right. So the other way to do that would be the daughter engages with mum and says, oh, okay, is there anything else, so that vase is going to granddaughter A. Is there anything else, mum, that you've thought of? And so she's actually engaging with mum.
Yeah.
And that could turn out to be a 15-minute conversation, which can be so valuable.
Absolutely. Can I ask you how you came to be a death doula? That's a great question. I've always wanted to ask you.
So I guess I've always had a bit of a vague interest in the end of life.
Yes.
And I've put my toe in the water from time to time, but not really had the time to take the deep dive. And many years ago, I read a book called With the End in Mind, which is written by a palliative care specialist in the UK called Dr. Catherine Mannix, who is amazing.
Great.
And the book just resonated with me. And from there, I, as you do a bit of Googling and in my spare time. And who knew at the time there were these people out there called death doulas.
Yeah, learning curve.
Or end-of-life doulas, or who actually journeyed with the person from when they were living well right through until death and after death. And just through family and friends, I have been exposed to sudden deaths, traumatic deaths, and I guess in every family there's the one that people go to. And
I'm currently playing that role for a non-family member. Yes.
Rightly or wrongly, I just seem to be that person. And I was happy to embrace that. And I was able to.
And I think that I think it's a really important point, when you have had exposure to death, you do go through this process of becoming more and more comfortable, more familiar, less frightened. And, the first death that you come across is, in my experience, the big one, that, it's an incredible learning curve. And then after that, you've got that experience to draw on. And so it's such a resource, it's such a resiliency, I guess, within you to have had that exposure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very important.
And so from there, I went on to do some study in the area, and I'm continuing to do that. So it's not a role that doesn't have training. So, of course, there's training involved.
Yeah.
But I need to make it clear too, Kirsten, that it's a non-medical role. Okay, so we leave the medical component of that up to the experts.
Yes.
So the palliative care team, the oncologists and the doctors.
Yep.
But we become part of the team, and we work with the medical people assisting that person, as well as all the other stakeholders in their care.
Well, I know a lot of medical people in the field of palliative care, and they talk about the family component, the psychological component, to be their most stressful role. The medical part is the less stressful. So if they've got a death doula or end-of-life doula there who is playing that role and is bridging and communicating and supporting, they are just going to be saying, thank you, you've just made my job so much easier.
That's right.
I really do understand what you mean by becoming part of that team.
And we fill the gaps.
Yeah, that's it.
Because those specialist nurses and doctors, and they are so overworked.
They're amazing,
yes.
But they're also very time poor.
That's right. They have to get on to their next client or their next patient, and we are the people that can come in and we can be part of that conversation. We can sit with the person while the palliative care team are talking to them as a second set of ears. The palliative care team go on to their next client, and then we're the ones that can stay with the person and have the cup of tea and have the chat and just sort of
take the time.
Yeah, debrief on that.
You need time.
And spend the time. And then we're the ones that can check in the next day or in 3 days' time.
And can I ask you about your personal experience? So have there been elements where you've gone, woof, this is very challenging, you know? What are the challenges, I guess, for you in this role?
I guess the big challenges are partly letting the medical teams know that we're around, and that we can be part of that team. Because even the medical fraternity think, oh my God, this death doula is going to come in and throw a spanner in the works. But that is not the case at all. So I think in Australia we've got a little bit of work to do with educating the medical fraternity about what we do.
Do they ever think you're this weird kind of voodoo witch-like character who's going to come in with all these beads and, you know, do like a trance? Like, is that actually...
Absolutely.
It could not be more wrong.
Yeah.
You're the opposite. You're actually about being quite quiet and listening and very grounded and very, very connected. You're not actually bringing you to this, are you?
No.
So, yeah, wow.
I think
But if they met you for a second, they'd know that's not true.
That's right. But when they see the word death doula,
yeah,
I think they think it's a little bit woo-woo.
Maybe death support worker, because they know what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So
when
advocating for your role is your challenge, really. Yeah. What about the emotional side, though? Do you have times where you think this is actually a bit tough for me?
Look, at the moment I don't. But I'm not suggesting that in the future that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
There will always be a case that will bring me undone. But the great thing is that we have a support mechanism
Yes.
in our little industry.
Great.
And it's important that we tap into that.
Yeah.
And it's important that we recognise our trigger points and to step away. And sometimes, Kirsten, we're not the right doula for the person.
Yeah, well, there has to be a connection and a match.
And that's an important point to make. So if I meet someone and I think, I really don't think that I can provide you with the service that you're wanting, or there's not a connection, or there's just some nuance there that's not sitting well, then I think I've got a responsibility to that person to say, look, I don't think I'm the right person, but I'm happy to support you in finding someone that does fit with your needs and what you're after.
That's a very good point. Can I say professionally for myself, I've noticed over my years that my level of being triggered is directly proportional to the age of the person who's dying. So the younger they are, particularly children, it's tough. It's really tough. And, you know, obviously there's often sudden death with children and it's supporting the parents. And that can be a very long process. And when you've got somebody who is sort of middle-aged and then they've got children, there's that layer of the child's grief, so that's really tough. Once we start to get more into the older ages, it's still an incredibly challenging area, but it's just less triggering for me. So that's really what I've noticed. And it's quite a role in your professionalism to manage yourself and to, do you hear my tummy? And to, you know, be able to manage that. Yeah.
I think that's really important. You've made a good point there, because in order to support the person, you've got to go in feeling...
Oh, yeah. You can't project, and you've got to hold your own reactions, responses.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not about us.
Yeah, and I've heard of people going along to psychologists and the psychologist bursts into tears and is really distressed and they're supporting the psychologist. It's horrendous. No. Yeah, you've got to be the backbone. You've got to be the strength for them, and that's so important.
That's right.
Yeah. How has being a death doula affected your personal life? Has it kind of made you... I don't know, I personally find that it makes me incredibly grateful for life and not take things for granted. I mean, not always, but pretty good. It's also made me incredibly mindful of things like, for example, possessions. I don't really have that same connection with possessions as some people might have. I really love streamlining life and not being cluttered. And that's ultimately because I understand we're not here for, the longest time. So it's actually been an incredible gift to me to work with people who are dying. Incredible gift. The depth of gratitude would be my summary. What are your thoughts?
I think gratitude's a big thing for me. And it's also about being grateful for the most simple of things.
Yeah.
It's the simple things that matter. And it's made me more engaging. It's made me able to, it's enabled me to lean in to the tough conversations and be comfortable doing that.
Yep.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And just holding space. Because sometimes just holding space with a person and meeting them where they're at is all they need in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
They don't necessarily need someone gabbing on in their ear.
No, quite the opposite.
What they need is just,
Yeah.
And, it's coming to the realisation that in the right moment, silence is all that person wants, but they just want someone to know that there's someone sitting beside them.
And that you're comfortable.
That's right.
And in that silence is comfort. Is I can hold this space with you.
That's right.
Tell you what, let's finish up on one of my favourite phrases, which is a good death. And I once spoke to a GP who just really was involved with palliative care, and she called it a great death. Yes. I thought, I've never heard of that. But a good death, in my understanding, is having put in the head work to understand that death happens.
Yes.
And to understand that, it's okay. And it's okay not to actually know what's going to happen next, but you'll be okay. And just that point of acceptance, and to live that way as well. And then they are actually quite settled, and or they might just have had enough of living, really.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
I do.
So what are your thoughts on the good death?
A good death is, it's an amazing experience for everyone involved. And that's the person, their loved ones and their families, but also their caregivers and their support team.
Absolutely.
To experience that.
There's a peace in there.
Yeah. And a good death, for me, means that the person has been given choices and has been able to make their choices.
Yeah.
Has been given back some control, and they've made choices dependent on that. That they have, they've opted for their preferred method of dying, and they're at peace with that. So they have made sort of, they've come to the recognition that it's going to happen, and acceptance.
Acceptance, that's a big word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Acceptance and peace.
Yeah.
And it can be a beautiful thing.
It can be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and that's the goal.
Yeah.
Deb, thank you so much. If anyone's out there and they want an amazing, grounded, sensitive and extremely intelligent death doula, jump on it and grab Deb Anderson. I don't know how they could find you. How can they find you if they're needing a death doula in the southeast Queensland area of Australia?
Southeast Queensland, yes. So I do have a website. My business name is called The Last Chapter.
The Last Chapter. That's one that you can remember. The Last Chapter.
The Last Chapter.
Great.
Yep.
Okay.
Very fitting.
Well, I cannot recommend Deb enough, everybody. So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Kirsten.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So if you want to catch me online, I've got all sorts of free resources on my website, KirstenHunterAuthor.com, Facebook and Instagram, Kirsten Hunter Author, and Twitter, Kirsten Hunter AU. Thank you so much, Deb.
Pleasure.
See you,
Thanks.
darling.
Bye.